Now is the time for us to listen to the needs of working families, the elderly, the children, the sick, the disabled, and the poor. Now is the time to restore confidence that the American government works for all of us and not just the few. Mr. President, let us be clear and let us in the Senate understand what the American people know all too well. And that is that our country is currently experiencing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression and the worst public health emergency in over 100 years. 90,000 Americans in 1 month. In the midst of all of this, over 90 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured and are unable to afford to go to a doctor when they become ill. The isolation and the anxiety caused by this pandemic has resulted in a horrible increase in mental illness, in depression, in anxiety, and in suicidal ideation. Mr. President, today, as we speak, over half of our people are living paycheck to paycheck, including millions of essential workers who put their lives on the line each and every day. More than 24 million Americans are unemployed, underemployed, or have given up looking for work. While hunger in this country, hunger in the richest country in the history of the world, is at the highest level that we have seen in decades. Because of lack of income, over 14 million Americans are behind on their rent, averaging some $5,800 a family, and many of those families face eviction all across this country. Americans who worry about eviction understand that they must not join the 500,000 Americans who are already homeless. That's some of what we are experiencing today. That's what the American people understand. Meanwhile, in the midst of this devastation to the working class and the middle class of our country, the wealthiest people in America are becoming much wealthier, and income and wealth inequality, a long-time problem, is now soaring. Incredibly, while families throughout the country are struggling to put food on the table to feed their kids, during this pandemic, 660 billionaires, not a whole lot of people, have increased their wealth by over $1 trillion. Mr. President, as a result of this pandemic, education in our country, from childcare to graduate school, is in chaos. The majority of young people in our nation have seen their education disrupted. Kids are not getting the learning that they need, falling further and further behind. And on top of that, it is likely that hundreds of colleges will soon cease to exist. Mr. President, in this moment of unprecedented crises, the Senate must respond through unprecedented action. The budget resolution we are debating today is simple and it is straightforward. It will enable us to pass President Biden's emergency COVID relief plan through reconciliation with 51 votes instead of 60. Now, Mr. President, I have heard from some of my Republican colleagues who tell us that, well, this reconciliation concept, that's a radical idea. Why are you using reconciliation? And they're telling us that it is absolutely imperative that we go forward in a bipartisan way and require 60 votes for passage. But I must say that when Republicans used this same reconciliation process, Mr. President, I didn't hear much about bipartisanship at that point. In fact, Republicans used the reconciliation process to provide trillions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 1% and large profitable corporations by a simple majority vote. The only people who voted for that bill were Republicans. No bipartisanship in that bill. My Republican colleagues used reconciliation to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for the drilling of oil, once again by a simple majority. Only people who supported that were Republicans, not one Democrat. As we all remember painfully, my Republican colleagues used the reconciliation process to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act and throw up to 32 million Americans off of the health care they currently have. And as you'll recall, Mr. President, that was a 100% partisan vote, which fortunately lost by one vote. Further, weeks before a presidential election, last election, my Republican colleagues pushed through their nominee for the Supreme Court with 50 votes. A few weeks before the election, not one Democrat supported that nominee. Totally partisan vote. Well, as the incoming chair of the Senate Budget Committee, this is what I believe. If Republicans can use reconciliation to help the wealthy and the powerful and pass legislation strongly opposed by the American people, we can and must use reconciliation to help Americans recover from the worst economic and public health crisis in the modern history of our country. In other words, now is the time for this Congress to stand with the working class and the middle class of this country and do what the overwhelming majority of the American people want us to do. Mr. President, it is worth pointing out that poll after poll shows an overwhelming majority of Americans, over 70%, support what President Biden and what we are trying to do. They know we have got to act boldly. So I hope we will not hear much more about bipartisanship, given my Republican colleagues' record on that issue. Mr. President, let us be clear. The working class of this country and the middle class are facing more economic desperation than at any time since the Great Depression. I have to tell you that to me, emotionally, it was a painful sight to see in my own city of Burlington, Vermont, hundreds of cars lined up so that families could get the food they needed to feed their kids. And what happened in Burlington is happening in every state of this country. People, many of whom have never had any public assistance at all, are now lining up to get emergency supplies of food in order to keep their families alive. Whether it is the pandemic, which is killing 3,000 people a day, whether it is the economic collapse, which is leaving millions of our people destitute, whether it is the disruption of education in this country, which means that kids are falling further and further behind, this Congress must act and act boldly. For too long, Mr. President, Congress has responded to the needs of the wealthy and the powerful and big money campaign contributors. Now is the time in this unprecedented set of crises for us to respond to the needs of working families, whether they're Black or white or Latino, Native American or Asian American. Mr. President, it is no secret that millions of our fellow Americans are literally giving up on democracy. Giving up on democracy. They think that the United States Congress and the United States government does not care a whit about the needs of working people. The people who go to work every day, who keep our country going, who put their lives on the line during this pandemic, and they look at us and they say, does anybody there in Washington, oh, you rich guys, do you understand what's going on in our lives? Well, this week during this debate, we are not only going to begin addressing the health and economic and educational crises we face, but maybe even more importantly, we're going to begin the process of restoring faith in the United States government. Maybe, just maybe, we can do what Abraham Lincoln talked about in the midst of the terrible Civil War, and that is be a government, act like a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and not just powerful special interests and their lobbyists. What will this budget resolution mean for the average American? I know we're throwing out a lot of numbers, a lot of money. What does it actually mean? How is it going to impact the lives of ordinary people? So let me just say a few words on that. Everybody is concerned about the pandemic, which has taken so many lives and caused so much illness and suffering. What this legislation is about is an effort to aggressively crush the pandemic and enable the American people to return to their jobs and schools. What this legislation means is that during this severe economic downturn, we must make sure that every American, low-income people, working-class people, middle-class people, have the financial resources that they need to live with dignity. This budget resolution will allow us to keep the promises that we made to the American people. Think about what that will mean to people who are losing hope right now. Passing this budget resolution means that during this raging pandemic, we will be able to provide health care to millions of Americans who are uninsured and underinsured by expanding Medicaid and improving the Affordable Care Act and other approaches. Passing this budget resolution means that we will go a long, long way forward to addressing the long-term problem of childhood poverty in America. And that is that by expanding the child tax credit, we have the opportunity to cut childhood poverty in this country in half and no longer be the major country on earth which has one of the highest rates of childhood poverty. Further, Mr. President, all of us must acknowledge that there is a pension crisis in America today. As a result of the greed on Wall Street, workers and retirees in multi-employer pension plans are in danger of seeing their retirement benefits cut by as much as 65%. That is unacceptable. Promises were made to those workers, and the United States Congress cannot renege on those promises. Mr. President, not only is this $1.9 trillion emergency COVID relief package the right thing to do from a moral perspective and a public policy perspective, it is exactly what the overwhelming majority of the American people want us to do. Mr. President, we are living in an unprecedented moment in American history. The last year has been a year the likes of which none of us have experienced in our lifetime. And the American people who are living in pain, in anxiety, in isolation, they are looking to the United States Senate and they are saying, are you going to hear and understand what we are going through? Are you going to do something to address the terrible problems in terms of health care, the economy, education that we are experiencing? Mr. President, it is no great secret that for many years, the Congress has listened very attentively to the needs of billionaires, to the needs of campaign contributors, to the needs of lobbyists. Now is the time for us to listen to the needs of working families, the elderly, the children, the sick, the disabled, and the poor. Now is the time to restore confidence that the American government works for all of us and not just the few. And, Mr. President, I urge passage of this important piece of legislation. And with that, Mr. President, I will yield the floor.